The Manifestation of the Sons of God, Chapter 21, The Power of Oneness. Before we read this chapter, I would like to preface something here. This is contingent upon a people that come into a life and into the realm of spirit. This cannot be achieved on a level of the soul, and it really can't be achieved by those in transition to a level of spirit. This really will only be achieved by those who attain a walk in the Spirit and a level of spiritual abiding and maturity. So with that in mind, this is more of a prophecy or not necessarily prediction, a prophecy of what is coming, but by no means is here at this point yet in the earth. We're seeing a visitation of power and authority which has not been in the earth before this time. We've seen a measure of power and authority, but until now that's all we've seen, a measure, the partial. God is bringing forth a mystical oneness within His church, and this mystical union will bring about a release of power and authority that will be the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 32, which, one can chase 1,000, two can put 10,000 to flight. Everything in the Spirit can be explained if you understand the working or dynamic of the spirit world. God is very scientific. All of His creation function through and by the principles He has created, whether they are principles that govern the natural realm or the spirit realm, whether they understand it or they do not. It makes no difference. There is much that we may see unfold and equate it to miracles. Yet if we look closer, they're just an operation of the principles that exist in the realm of spirit. Just like gravity is a principle in the natural world, so the functioning of the spirit flows along similar scientific channels of established principles. It has always intrigued me to understand just what we were experiencing from a scientific perspective as we followed on to know the Lord. In the Old Testament, the Word speaks how the children of Israel saw the mighty acts of God. But only Moses knew His ways. Psalms 103. Moses understood the dynamics of God's ways and how they worked. You might say the dynamics of the whole realm of spirit and how it worked. He knew how it was done. The children of Israel only saw the manifestation or outworking. There are times when you flow along with the Spirit of the Lord as He brings changes, never really understanding the dynamics. Then there are times when He brings understanding to your heart and you begin to see things more clearly. Perhaps this description of the power of oneness will shed some light on what God is establishing during this season of time that we call the manifestation of the sons of God, or you could also call it the time of the parousia. Anne's father was a very bright and scientific individual. He was an engineer and was involved with the development of the helicopter. We enjoyed sitting back and listening to his stories. He was also very analytical and was always looking deeper, trying to dissect and understand the moving of God. Here's a little snapshot of a discussion we had many years ago. We're going to talk about frequency, harmonics, and resonance, basic principles that operate in the natural plane. And this will give us an insight into what we're experiencing during this season. With a radio, you're able to electronically tune into various frequencies. You can continue to turn the dial until the electronic frequency of the radio is equal to what is called the RF signal, or RF frequency being emitted from a radio station. When this happens, they intermesh, and there's a release of power, and voila, you can hear what's being transmitted right from that radio station, because you're on the same frequency as what they are putting out. Individually, there appears to be no energy there yet. When these two electronic frequencies become one, or harmonic, in the same realm at exactly the same frequency, then there's a power that's released. Another example of this principle of harmonics or resonance would be something which happened years ago when a new model of helicopter was being developed and tested. Some of the helicopters had experienced a resonant frequency that was so powerful that the helicopters actually blew up. So they conducted experiments to find out what to do about this, how to change the design of the copter so that these frequencies would not become resonant. When a helicopter does not have enough of what's called dampening, then there's a tendency for that helicopter to reach a state of resonance. So what happens when a helicopter reaches a state of resonance? A great deal. You might even say it's explosive. So in effect, what is resonance? Well, resonance deals with the frequency of an object. It could be your frequency, my frequency. Every object has a certain frequency about it in all of God's creation. When those frequencies of, let's say, two individuals become resonant, which would be an overlapping vibration of energy at the same state, then you have an explosive release of energy. Now, it's very, very rare for that to happen, and I would say probably just about impossible on a natural plane for humans to resonate at the same frequency. But it is, something that can happen when you're dealing with electronics, mechanics, things that you can actually adjust the oscillation or the actual frequency of the object. Where with people, you cannot really do that, but with with these other elements you can. So that's kind of a very rough definition. So what happens, to best explain the reaction with this helicopter example, would be to say that the frequency of the helicopter touching the ground and the frequency of the main rotor blade, which is the transmission and tail rotor, all end up vibrating or resonating at the same frequency. Now, this is very unusual because you have the helicopter itself has a certain frequency to it. The tail rotor, the transmission, the rotor blade, all of these things have unique frequencies. And I know this can be kind of difficult to understand. However, what happens on a very freakish event would be if they all ended up vibrating at the same frequency. They would all come into a state of resonance, and that would almost be like what you would term a nuclear explosion, that powerful. And so what happens, the helicopter is literally destroyed within microseconds because of the exponential release of power that can't even be graphed. So kind of work with us here. We're trying to kind of understand what it means to come into oneness. Because you can read about it in the scriptures, and the Lord says, well, he talks about the oneness, I and the Father are one, and, you and I and whatnot. I mean, but we really don't understand oneness because we understand it from the basic Webster's definition of oneness. And we're dealing with something entirely different here. It's like trying to approach spiritual truths from a mental plane of the soul. It doesn't compute because it's not in your dictionary. Even though it seems like it's the same word, it's not at all. And that's been the challenge to come into sonship, and the challenge of change, and the challenge of what the sons are going through as God births them into a world of spirit. that has a whole different set of principles and values and paradigm, and everything is different. And yet you can approach it and give it a definition. Well, this is this and this is this. But it has no relationship to the natural plane that we know of whatsoever. And yet, if you approach it through your mind and you say, well, this is what's happening, you think you can understand, but you can't understand the realm of spirit from the carnal mind. It has to be experienced and understood from the renewed mind of Christ. So basically in this example, what happened? The frequencies overlapped, and the exponential release of power absolutely just tore the helicopter apart. So resonant frequency, to summarize, is when two objects are vibrating at exactly the same frequency, and they become what's called resonant. Their vibration overlaps, and the atoms are transferred back and forth between those objects, causing a power to be unleashed that goes up exponentially. It goes straight up. Like I said, you can't even graph it. It goes up to infinity. That is how powerful the resonant experience is. I mean, to try and understand this, scientifically here, just visualize for a moment atoms transferring back and forth. So you have two different objects. They're comprised of matter at the base level, which is atoms and other components, but they're each their own entity. You could say, well, I have a rotor here, and it's this. I can touch it and feel it and see it. Then you have this other item over here. They're entirely two separate. But what happens when these items vibrate or come into resonance at the same frequency? Literally, the atoms of both items begin to go back and forth and between the two of them. It's kind of hard to imagine that. Try and visualize with me. What are we talking about when we talk about oneness? Oneness in God, which is really the whole reason here for this word. Oneness is God, and God is you become one with the Father. The Father becomes one with you. You become one with Christ. Christ becomes one with you. What is that all about? Is it just because you give yourself to the Lord and you love Him, and so therefore you think His thoughts, and you're always meditating on Him and worshiping Him, and so that is oneness? And that you've given up yourself to not my will but thine be done? Is that oneness? Not really. Not what we're talking about. What happens is so astounding, so mind-boggling that we can't even understand what sonship is all about. We can't understand what it means when the Father wants to take up His abode in the sons. I mean, literally, take up His abode in the sons. What is that all about? Is that just some experience of the overlap of the Father and so, kind of like what we would talk about when you see entities that are attached to people and you say, oh, that person's got a dozen entities. I mean, is that what we're talking about in the oneness of the Father indwelling the Godhead, the sons? Absolutely not. It's a lot more. That's why it is so much more powerful that our minds can't even understand it. What happens? What happens when the Son comes into a state of resonance, if you will, with the Father, and the Father comes into a state of resonance with the Son? What happens? At a molecular level, at a level that's even way lower than that, higher, whatever. There's an exchange of energy, An exchange of atoms, if you want to call it like we've been talking. And all of a sudden, it's the Father, but it's you. But it's the Father, but it's you. Christ said, "Have you not seen me? If you saw me, you would know that I'm in the Father and the Father's in me." Very deep. What did Christ experience? He didn't tell us. We're going to find out experientially, and then he'll probably say, "Okay, let me explain to you what happened to you." In this whole experience of resonance, where you literally become one with God, you literally become one with Christ, there is an exchange of energy at the very base level of creation, the very base level of sound and molecules and quarks and all the very most minutest levels of creation, which we can't even define. There is an exchange of energy that's going on. And you look at it and say, "That's you, but it's not you, it's the Lord, but it's you." Have you ever had those kinds of visions? We've had a few. You look and you say, "That's the Lord." "Oh, no, that's me." "No, that's the Lord." What's happening? A lot more than just what we would just call the interpenetration of God and man. A lot more. Well, we kind of deviated from this chapter, but I felt this was really important to really understand that we're dealing with something far greater than we are able to understand. So let me go back. I kind of strayed off here, but let me go ahead and finish reading. So I realize this is a lot to grasp, but the point is we're driving at here is that on a scriptural level, this would be a scientific explanation of what happens when you have two people in agreement. One puts 1,000, two puts 10,000 to flight. It's the principle of our harmonic resonance as it's experienced with the suns. It's always fascinated me to delve into the scriptures and really search to understand the ways of God, to ask God, how does this work? When he brings simple little explanations, or in this case, perhaps it's a bit technical, it just has a tendency to come together. When we talk about oneness, this is what we're looking for. Not an agreement of the soul, but an agreement, not even an agreement, a resonance of spirit. This is a scientific definition of what happens when you literally achieve oneness. This breaks the religious concept of how we've looked at oneness and what we thought oneness might be. What God is bringing in this experience of oneness is not an agreement born of the soul. We're not talking about a group of people sitting around and agreeing. We're not talking about a prayer breakfast where they all come to a decision. We're talking about a provision or reality that has been set apart for this day. True oneness is a reality that can only be manifested from the Spirit by a people who walk in the Spirit. And what we have seen to this point has been a general level of agreement born of the soul that has achieved very little. But when God speaks of the power of oneness or the power of agreement, he is speaking of the potential that is unleashed when his sons truly achieve a resonant state of interconnectedness. It's true oneness. In the book of Acts, it says, Acts 2, they were all together in one room with one mind, seeking the Lord when the Spirit fell. I believe there was something they were tapping into in a level of oneness, but it wasn't this that we're referring to, but there was something that they had tapped into. Very similar to what happened at the Tower of Babel, if you recall that story, because there was some level of oneness or agreement that the satanic host had showed the people on how to achieve something, and so therefore almost anything became possible for them. And so the Father had to just, as we know, nail that thing. And all of that is just a measure of what is knocking at the door as we enter into this oneness with the Father. All of those were tapping into spiritual truths and principles. And so if you can see, just by barely tapping into it, what was being created by virtue of the Tower of Babel. And that was just a token of what was coming. Joel prophesied about this level of oneness to come, a oneness that would cause greater works, a oneness that would create open doors to see the kingdom established. By this oneness, we'll see the exponential release of the power of God on the earth on a level never before seen. And how will this happen? The sons of God will enter into a resonant, vibrating spiritual frequency, if you will. I know this is like a lot of words. And it's going to create something the likes we've never seen before. This is what's coming. This is what is here at the door, but it's coming. We've had glimpses of this oneness, but we've only experienced the partial. What we may have thought was oneness was really more of a level of agreement born of the soul. What we're speaking of is a oneness that will release the power of God, encompassing the greater works which Christ spoke of. We know that God has brought his sons to this precise juncture in time, but we also understand that we must make the shift to this next transition. And how quickly we can achieve this oneness is dependent upon how quickly we change and how deep the work of the cross has gone. There's only been one word that's been coming. It's been the work of the cross. That's been the word. The sons of God are being trained in the ways of spirit. We've said this before. This principle of resonating oneness will become an experience that God's sons will not only enter into, but they will know how they achieved it. And they will live in this, and they will be able to access this at any point. We've walked in a level of the oneness born of the soul, but this is not the oneness coming. This is not what we're speaking of. That was the day of the church age, but we've come to the days of the kingdom. We've been at this threshold for some time. Now is a time that we will enter through this portal into this resonating oneness. And when this is achieved, the world will know it.